me, success is living in complete obedience to Jesus. It's not just looking at it from what external views of success might be, but really more what an eternal view of success would be.
God has given each of us special gifts, and it's our job to figure out what they are and where He would have us use them.
One has to trust God because nothing is guaranteed. Even health and the length of our life is not guaranteed.
Impacting the marketplace with our faith, that we demonstrate that faith every day in what we do, how we do it, that it leaves anybody that we do business with. They leave our presence with a desire to grow closer to God.
At this time, I'd like to introduce Rob Wildeboer. As all of you know from the material that was sent out, Rob is, as I mentioned earlier, co-founder and executive chairman of Martinrea. He's also a member of the ELO Advisory Board for Ontario and a recent recipient of the Entrepreneurial Leaders Award a couple of years ago in Toronto. Rob, welcome here.
How you doing?
Great, great. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. We have hundreds of people joining the webinar from around the world. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be posing a number of questions that we discussed earlier. We have a lot of ground to cover, so we'll jump right into it. Just to start off with, to give people a bit of context, we know you're now leading Martinrea. What were you doing before you co-founded the company?
Well, I won't go back to my birthday. That's a little too far, but
that's a lot of decades.
That's a long time. So I did a lot of study in things like political studies, economics, philosophy, business, and law. I was a lawyer at a big law firm called Steichen Elliott in the late 80s and early 90s. Started my own firm called Wildeboer DeLeese with a number of friends, including Perry DeLeese. In '93, we focused on corporate securities law, tax law, corporate finance, and spent a lot of time as an entrepreneurial law firm actually working with a lot of entrepreneurial companies. We were, for example, securities lawyers for a little company called Research in Motion,
right.
A company called Open Text.
Sorry, Rob, if I can stop you there. So for those of you who don't know, the little company that Rob referred to, Research in Motion, what was the brand that they might be best known for?
Maybe BlackBerry. So
right.
we're the first lawyers with BlackBerries way back when, and I still have one. So I'm a little slow on the uptake, but I'm still loyal.
Still loyal to BlackBerry. So Rob's had a lot of great corporate experience. Now you have a legal background. You're a member of that esteemed profession. So what led you to co-found a company? Why did you embark on an entrepreneurial path?
Well, I was always very interested in business and helping to build things, and we did that with the law firm. We did that with a lot of advice, and then I got actually cold called to join Magna as an EVP and special counsel to the chairman, who was Frank Stronach, fairly entrepreneurial guy. We had some different views of the world, but it certainly introduced me to the automotive business, which was fascinating. And the business model of Magna, which was very entrepreneurial, was fascinating. And then after a little while, I was chairman of a little metal forming company called Royal Laser, and ended up turning that into an auto parts company with some senior guys from Magna back in 2001.
Right. So just to clarify for people, so when you refer to Frank Stronach and Magna, Frank Stronach was previously quite a well-known entrepreneur, philanthropist. So maybe, and Magna is an extremely well-known company. So maybe just describe like who Frank Stronach was. I mean, this is a very prominent business person.
So Frank founded his auto parts company when he came over from Austria in the late 50s, and basically grew that into what is now the third largest auto parts company in the world, although he's been gone from Magna for about 10 years. It was a Canada-based company, also in Europe and in Asia, and it's a big metal former. Basically, just about anything that you have in the car, that's what the company does. It's also had a very entrepreneurial model in the sense that every plant was kind of its own economy. The general manager of each plant was kind of a president of his or her own enterprise, and very entrepreneurially focused and extremely successful.
Right. So one thing just to highlight for people who may not be familiar with the auto parts industry is that, the large manufacturers, the brand names of the cars that we're all familiar with, whether it's Ford, GM, Chrysler, they're almost assemblers of parts rather than manufacturers. So what's quite interesting is that there's auto parts manufacturers like yourselves that are massive, but of course are not known really to the public.
Yeah, that's right.
So what I'd like to do is, so you co-founded Martinrea. So just give people a scope as to the size of the company prior to the pandemic. So the size of the company up to a couple of months ago.
Sure. So we started with basically zero auto revenues in 2001. Actually, our first day was September 10, 2001. We were looking for financing because we bought some presses. So the next day was, of course, 9/11. And we wondered maybe our timing wasn't the best, and how do we grow this business? So this is not the first challenge our company has faced. Over the years, we've grown to the extent that pre-pandemic, we're up to 17,000 people, 57 plants in 9 countries on 5 continents. And we're a leader in metal forming technologies, both in steel and aluminum. We're the second largest metal former in North America, one of the largest aluminum parts makers in the automotive business, and we also specialize in fluid systems, which is the fuel lines and the brake lines and the fuel fillers you see in your vehicle. We also have an industrial division that makes parts for people like John Deere.
Right. So the company is headquartered in the Greater Toronto area, and now when you started the company, so as you say, back September 10th, 2001. So you've got this idea, and having grown to 17,000 employees in this massive scale, what would you say was the key to the phenomenal growth and development of the company?
Yeah, I think we were very focused. So we spent a lot of time on culture at our company, and our vision is making people's lives better by being the best we can do in the products we make and the services we provide. And our focus from the beginning has been, in essence, focused on 3 different elements. One is at the center is a treat people the way you want to be treated culture. So a very giving culture, a golden rule culture. And there's 2 elements that really, I think, summarize our approach to business and making of auto parts. One is we're lean. So lean manufacturing means you're always looking at continuous improvement, basically taking waste out. That is absolutely critical to the auto business. It's a cost game, it's an efficiency game, and you're always looking at innovating to get better that way. And at the same time, we're very entrepreneurial. So we encourage people. That doesn't mean roll the dice. That means understand your risks, but really take ownership of what you do. So we have a very flat organization where at every level, whether it's the supervisor level, whether it's the worker on the line, whether it's the general manager level, whether it's even the executive level, you're effectively responsible for what you do, and you're paid for what you do. So in essence, if you have a profitable plant, the profits of that plant effectively determine a good chunk of your compensation. And if you tell me how someone is paid, I'll probably tell you how that person's going to act.
Right. Now, it's interesting in terms of the scope of your operations around the world. So you mentioned you're on 5 continents. Maybe just do a quick scan, because it's so relevant to this global pandemic. So a quick scan of which countries, where are the bulk of your employees?
So we started in Canada. In Canada, we have about 2,500 employees now. We have about 5,000 in the States. We have about 5,000 in Mexico. We have a few thousand in Europe. We have a few hundred in Brazil, and we have now about 1,000 in China. So certainly in the context of what's been happening around the world with the pandemic, we've experienced it at different levels everywhere. So for example, China was shut down in the first quarter of this year. We shut down our plants. They're largely operating again. In Europe, shut down, they're ramping up relatively slowly right now, but they are ramping up. And in North America, we basically, we're completely shut down for a period of time. And we've just started to ramp up our automotive operations, a lot of them just this week.
Right. So if we go back to when the pandemic was first identified as a serious problem, what was the immediate reaction of yourself and the company? So you have this massive global operation, and now this event comes, which is really unprecedented in anybody's living memory. So what was the initial reaction of you and your team?
Well, to a certain extent, it's not every day that you're working full time one week and then shutting down your operations the next week and going from 100% revenues to 0% revenues in your plants, which is basically what happened in the various jurisdictions as we locked down. And in most places, by the way, the lockdown in automotive was voluntary. Demand was leaving and so forth. We're an essential business just about everywhere that we are. But at the end of the day, for safety reasons and because we were dealing with something that was kind of new, a lot of us shut down our operations voluntarily and are reopening them voluntarily now. But when you go from revenues and profits, and we were doing extremely well in terms of profitability and growth. Last year was our best year ever, and so forth. All of a sudden, you've got to get to a stage where you say, I have to preserve the enterprise, and I have to move extremely quickly. So just to give you a sense, we had 17,000 employed. Within a week, we had close to 14,000 on layoff, which is absolutely amazing, because what you've got to do is you've got to preserve your costs and so forth. And that gives you a sense of how quick that is. And probably next to the airlines, I think automotive and cruise ships, automotive basically stopped overnight.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that for the auto parts industry, they were actually voluntary actions on behalf of your company. So maybe just talk about this one issue that, sometimes the media seems to position the government looking out for the best interests of the health of workers in opposition maybe to businesses' desire to seemingly, want to steam ahead and sacrifice people's, health or not address the health issues. Whereas, for your company, talk about the priority you place on, workers' safety and how that factors into your decision making.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the fact that, governments like to say we take care of our people, and, governments are politicians and they take care of their interests and so forth. And there's certainly a legitimate kindness and affection for what they say they do. But in today's day and age, you've got to keep your people safe. And I get back to the culture of our business. It's making people's lives better. The first place you've got to focus is on your own people. And at the end of the day, our employees have to feel safe and they have to be safe. And so in the context of what we were seeing and our customers were seeing and so forth, there were COVID cases happening in some of the plants of our customers, and they basically made a decision to shut down. But overall, the entire approach of our industry, and I think of other industries as well, is you've got to take care of your people. If you don't take care of your people, then you don't get their loyalty, you don't get their best, and they'll find places to work elsewhere. That's a fundamental principle of running a business.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of your interaction with government, so we have this very unique situation where the government, let's say in Canada, but you worked with governments obviously in other countries where your plants are located. The government has stepped in and obviously acting in what it perceives as the best interests of the entire community, the entire country.
Yeah.
Now, what's your view of how, let's say, the government, now in your case, it would be government in Ontario. So maybe just describe what the Ontario government is doing first and how you've interacted with them.
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is, we're participants in an industry that's multinational, very detailed, It's an industry that works very closely with jurisdictions. Every jurisdiction in the world wants to attract automotive manufacturing and manufacturing in general, and we're at the leading edge of that curve. So in that context, we spend a lot of time working with governmental organizations everywhere. So, and that includes the United States, includes Mexico, includes Canada, and includes Ontario. So one of my jobs as executive chairman and co-founder and so forth is to interface on a public policy level with a lot of governmental authorities, and indeed they seek that out on a consistent basis. In Canada, we have something called the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. It's made up of the original equipment manufacturers that make cars, so Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and so forth. Leading Canadian suppliers like Magna, Linamar, and ourselves. Unifor, which is the union, and the Minister of Finance federally, or Minister of Industry federally and provincially in Quebec and Ontario. So we have ongoing dialogue, and I'd say that the first dialogue is, what do we do? What do we do in automotive? And we actually had a COVID-19 task force that I happen to be the co-chair of, and we gave certain recommendations. And we gave recommendations on liquidity, which is, you need OEMs that can effectively operate in Canada. You need dealerships open. You need people to be able to buy vehicles and so forth in order to resuscitate the industry. But we also focused a lot on protocols. And we said, we as an industry are developing protocols of safety for our workers that will be second to none, and that effectively will take care of our people so that they are safe and they feel safe. And so at the end of the day, you can follow our protocols, and indeed, the government's protocols that have been passed, whether it's from the White House or whether it's from Ontario or whether it's federally, are probably in many ways less detailed than the protocols we have in our own plants, working with Unifor and the US, the UAW, and suppliers and OEMs and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is, how do we plan a restart so that effectively we can restart across North America on an efficient basis? So I would say, I've been very heavily involved. I'm not the only one that's been heavily involved, but it's probably been, if I would keep hours like I used to as a lawyer, it's been my biggest file for the last 2 months. And certainly, talking with Premier Ford and his team and the feds and people in different jurisdictions, they do want to see the industry restart, and they do want to see it done in a particular way. And in the context of Ontario, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to interject there. There's a few questions coming in specifically on dealing with employees. So one's from our friend Dick Barendrake, whom you know from Oxford. So hi, Dick.
How you doing?
You're
in a while.
Out in Grand Prairie or in Alberta. In any event, can you define more broadly the taking care of our people? Like how does that set you apart? Like, would you say that's something you do uniquely?
Well, I would say that our company does extremely well, and I've said, and I'm not the first to say it, Peter Drucker said it, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you spend a lot of time on your culture and what differentiates you, particularly when times are tougher. Mm-hmm. And I think that in the context of what we're seeing, and this is a societal observation, work is a place that people want to come to and actually see it as a purpose-driven thing. And they also want to see it as kind of a comfort zone. You have to feel safe at work. So we spend a lot of time, and this isn't just physical safety. This is the type of empowerment that you have when you come and have a job. We have a very exciting industry because we see new technologies. We're applying them a lot. We give a lot of responsibility to people on the floor. So I would say that, what I really want an employee that works at Martinrea to say is, these people care for me. They give me job security in the sense that, while I can't guarantee that someone will buy our products or that people will ultimately buy cars, as we see right now, I can certainly ensure that we have a competitive company, and that's your best job security. And when we grow, we provide opportunity for our people. And I spend time on that all the time. Our CEO, Pat DeRamo, who's got a Toyota background, spends time on that all the time. Our HR people, everybody does. And what we say is, HR is not just in the HR department, everyone's part of HR. So that kind of gives you a sense.
Well, and successful companies, of course, invest a lot of time and effort into their people. Now, there's Absolutely. A question from Bernie Thiessen in Chilliwack. I think you might remember Bernie from Oxford also. Now, he asked a question, you grew quickly. Now, did the growth did you grow mostly by starting your own production plants or by expanding existing operations? And just to tie it into what we've been discussing, one of the challenges with acquisitions is melding a culture or getting the acquired company and those people to understand, appreciate, merge into your culture. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah. No, that's a lot there. We've spent a career working on that. So when we started in 2001, we basically figured, people say, why do we need another supplier? And we said, the industry needs good, healthy suppliers because the industry's in distress. A lot of people have too much debt. A lot of people are in the wrong places, doing old habits the wrong way, tough union contracts, etc. So in that sense, we were kind of refreshing for a lot of people, and we grew our business from about 0 to 2 billion Canadian from 2001 to 2007. And we did that, some organic growth and some by acquisitions. And almost all our acquisitions were of distressed companies. The benefit of that is it's cheap. You're helping your customers, but you can change culture because it didn't work so well for the people that went bankrupt. And so we did a lot of that growth to 2007. And of course, we went to about half in 2008 and 9. And then since that time, we've grown mainly organically. We've done 2 acquisitions in there, but we've been really spending time over the last number of years focusing on culture. The problem with acquisitions is 90% of them don't work, in part because you're not melding the culture. We're at the stage now where we kind of say, this is our culture. This is the way that we're going to do it. At the end of the day, if you don't care for your people, there are other places that you can work and so forth. And we spend a lot of time on it.
Well, one thing I know from our previous interactions is that you like to integrate this concept of the golden rule into the corporate culture. Now, as a Christian and a leader in your company, I know describe how you're quite careful about integrating some core Christian concepts without any notion of proselytization, but just this is who you are. This is what the culture is. So just talk about how you've integrated some of those things.
Sure. Well, I'll do one example. I mean, we've talked about our culture at annual shareholder meetings. We do it in investor presentations, and you can see our culture slide and our principles slide in every presentation that we do. And in the context of it, I say the golden rule, which is treat people the way you want to be treated. It's actually a Christian principle. There are similar principles in other religions, but if you can come up with a better way to run a business, then I have to hear it. Treat your supplier the way you want to be treated. We're a supplier to some of the biggest customers on earth, and they're tough. They're very, very tough. But at the end of the day, let's treat our suppliers, because in times like this, at times right now, these are suppliers that can help us. They can make us or break us. Treat your employees the way you want to be treated. And, the way we say it is, if someone comes in the door or you're treating a receptionist in a particular way, think about that as your daughter. How do you want that person to be treated? And those are things that resonate with people. We say the same thing with customers. We say the same thing about in your communities. And it just resonates with people. And at the end of the day, as our head of HR says, be nice. Be nice. You can wake up in the morning, you can choose to be nice, or you can choose not to be nice. You should choose to be nice, because at the end of the day, as leaders, people watch you all the time. Yeah. And I find that resonates with people. And going back to the circle of safety, people have to be safe to talk about that in their workplaces, whether they're Christian or whether they're atheists or whether they're Muslim or whether they're Hindu. And we have all kinds of different people. Like, we're a cosmopolitan group, being in all the countries that we're in. We have plants that have 50 different nationalities. So I have no problem speaking about it. And I'll treat someone with dignity and respect, regardless of their worldview.
So we have a question from David Veal down in California. And this is actually one of the questions I was going to ask, and I'd say it's actually at the core of a lot of what we're talking about. So he asks about how can you keep your people safe if they don't have a job? Isn't it better to keep people working in some way rather than to not have them work at all? So just address this issue, in terms of there's the physical safety, but there's the cost of, especially as you mentioned to me previously, blue collar workers generally cannot work remotely. So this is a massive issue. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, for the last 2 months, I've been actually doing some writing with some other folks, people like Ray Pennings at Cardis, who's a better writer than I am and can put any of my ideas into penmanship better than I can, and Brian Lee Crowley at McDonald Laurier Institute. But at the end of the day, I think that even looking at the health issues and everything else, when you have an economy that's not working, when you have people that are not working, you have very unhealthy situations. Whether it's mental health, it's no fun to be poor. It's no fun to have stress. It's no fun to not be able to afford the type of medical care that you need. And at the end of the day, it is a very, very bad thing to have high unemployment. And so I've been advocating all the way through that, we understand the COVID-19 is a threat. Let's understand the scope of the threat. Let's deal with the scope of the threat. Let's deal with the surge. But at the end of the day, be very careful about stopping your economy. And the mass shutdowns of the economy, we've managed to, I think, flatten the curve. On COVID-19, we've also flattened the economy. And at the end of the day, the government, I think, has overreached mightily when it comes to the shutdowns that they've had. I think you got to focus on the vulnerable, but you have to recognize that there are huge societal issues when you shut down an economy. And just to take our people, our people, it's 13,500 to 14,000 on layoff. Those are people that want to work. They want to have a job. They want to have the benefits of doing that. And we are working extremely hard to get them back to work. There's a lot of people that just don't have 6 months of savings to effectively take this kind of hit and isolate themselves.
Well, you're in a unique position to comment on this notion as to how governments should respond to this type of crisis. So, for example, in Canada, we have this notion of flattening the curve and being, to some people's views, like quite aggressive. Then in the U.S., in a variety of the states, seems to be a bit of a different model of getting people back to work and maybe accepting some health challenges. So from your viewpoint, especially having plants in the U.S., in Canada, in China, in Brazil, in Europe, is the response? Is there really no correct way to respond? People are all just doing the best they can, and we'll just have to see what actually worked.
Well, I think, politicians listen to the people that vote for them and, the constituencies that they have at a particular point in time. And no politician wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I want to screw up the economy, or I want to screw up people's lives. Most people are service oriented or public service oriented. But I think what we've done in the context of something that was a little unknowing, and because of the experience that happened in Italy in the first place with the surge overwhelming the hospital system, is we had basically three groups: politicians, epidemiological experts, and journalists. Basically, scare the crap out of a lot of people. And certainly there's an element of concern here, and no one wants to have the healthcare system overwhelmed. But after scaring people and putting them in the lockdown and all that type of stuff, now I think the issue for a lot of politicians is, how do I change the dialogue without looking silly? And at the end of the day, in Ontario, for example, in particular, what we heard and saw the grass of was, here's the surge. We saw the same thing in New York. We saw the same thing in Michigan, where we have a number of our people, and where Michigan has been probably stricter in lockdowns than Ontario and a number of other jurisdictions. And so in that context, you've got to say, all right, I get the fact that we've got to deal with the surge and we don't want to be overwhelmed. And so, for example, the lack of ventilators, when the governor of New York says we need 40,000 ventilators, our industrial operations jumped in and said, what can we do to help? So we're actually making the ventilator stands for General Motors, which is shown on 60 Minutes and everything. We're making 30,000 ventilator stands. In the course of it, I asked, how many ventilators do you really need? In Ontario, and this was with 50 people on the line, including the premier and the leading health officials, They said, we have 2,300 ventilators. I said, how many do you need? They say 3,500. I says, 3,500 more? No, 3,500 in total. Well, 1,200 ventilators for a province of 15 million people. So why do you need 30,000 ventilators? Well, we probably don't, but maybe we do. Okay, so we build up those things. We build up the capacity so that we can handle the surge. But now the dialogue has to be different, which is if we've dealt with the surge, we're not going to eliminate the virus completely. We're going to have to deal with it until we have a vaccine or whatever. How do we essentially balance what we've done and then get people moving again and effectively, you know, stop the lockdowns so that people have the freedom to move around, and there's a freedom issue here. Get people working again so that we don't effectively bankrupt our governments and you know, put huge burdens on our children. And effectively, you know, I think bringing back a certain amount of sanity to what's been a huge reaction against the COVID-19 threat. There's a threat, but I think the reaction's been overdone.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the lockdown, let's just talk about that for a minute. Now, in one of your articles, you referred to the notion of how a government engages its population to try to bring about a response to a pandemic. So, in other words, the government can say, you know, like as it does in Canada on a federal basis, that, you know, we have financial resources and in a sense, we're taking care of you. Now, you mentioned in your article that, you know, the government could have taken a slightly different approach of actually engaging various constituencies, including faith-based groups, unions, businesses, to sort of push down the response to that level and get a spectrum, a broader spectrum of people involved in addressing this issue. So maybe you can just speak to that.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and we might want to, you know, divide it into categories and so forth. There's certainly a lot there, but you know, the view that we're government, we're the solution to all your problems is a problem. You know, at the end of the day, we have many institutions that are focused on taking care of people. Certainly churches are one, and there are a number of charitable organizations, but companies and industry associations do it as well. And, you know, I talked about the protocols in our industry. They were developed by industry. The protocols in the food industry were developed by the food industry, which has been going gangbusters, of course, over the last couple of months. And so at the end of the day, this view that, you know, we're going to come in and take over everything, while, you know, a frightened people will look to that for a period of time. At the end of the day, let's use all the strengths that we have in society to do it. And you know, the reality is people tend to react over time, and they tend to be relatively wise. There are always people that, you know, are a little silly in terms of what they do. But, you know, one of the benefits of what we've seen here is people have learned a certain amount of social distancing when you're sick and when there's a virus. They've learned to wash their hands and personal hygiene. If you're sick, you don't come to work, and, you know, you do those types of things. I don't think we need too many laws to enforce that right now. You know, the fact is there are a lot of places that have open restaurants, and people aren't going to restaurants, and they won't go to restaurants until they're comfortable they can. It's the same with air travel. You know, there's no prohibition on air travel right now, but people aren't traveling because they want to feel safe and so forth. So you don't need a law for that, right? And at the end of the day, people are going to be careful. They're going to take care of their loved ones and so forth in terms of health things. So, you know, the reality is I don't think we need the level of government intrusion that we need. And then just on the freedom issue and the constitutional issue, you know, I have a constitutional right in Canada, and it's even broader in the United States, for example. I have the right for freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so forth. And at the end of the day, it may not be politically correct, but I have those rights. I have those constitutional rights. The government in Canada has the right to basically restrict my freedom on that, but it has to have a demonstrable reason for that, right? And at the end of the day, you can debate the demonstrable evidence for that. So I think that we are where we are in the broad lockdowns and everything else. You know, it's effectively taking a sledgehammer where, you know, a nice little hammer could have sufficed, where you focus on who's vulnerable.
Now, in one of your articles, you talked about the present pandemic is like a war-like situation, and government leaders are, in a sense, like the generals who are directing people. Now, what do you think good leadership looks like in these situations?
You know, I think first of all, a lot of leaders are trying their best. Okay, so I always defer to the good intentions of leaders, with some exceptions perhaps, and I wouldn't say that about the leader in North Korea, for example. But at the end of the day, if we're in a war or a fight with COVID-19, you gotta boost the troops, and so in that sense. And the other thing about leadership is when you're going to take an avenue, you've got to understand what your exit strategy is and talk about the exit strategy in a way that people can see it and understand it and see progress, et cetera. And that's how you build morale. And that's, the Churchillian view, even to say, this is the end of the beginning. It may not be the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. We're going to fight it here, there, and everything else. I think that, that works more effectively. In the United States, we've had different people try to do different things, but there's a lot of party politics. So even if you're right, it's very interesting. We haven't seen a coalescing around a political view that we're going to fight this and we're going to win this. Not a consistent one, although I think for sure the shift in the United States is that we're going to move on with our lives. We're going to deal with the pandemic. We're going to open up our economy. We're America. We're a great superpower. We need to be a good economic power. We're better than this. And I think that is the trend line. And I think America will come out of this probably stronger than people give it credit for. But the danger of coming in, you can't turn this into a Vietnam or an Afghanistan or an Iraq. And I think that's the problem that a lot of politicians have when they say, we've got to flatten the curve. We're going to effectively lock you down. And now they've got to change the dialogue, which is how do you justify opening up?
Yeah. So for a lot of business people, so on the one hand, there'll be long-term consequences. So if we leave aside the political implications of this whole crisis, but if we just look at on a business scale, what do you think will be some of the long-term implications of this whole situation?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, but let's take my business, which is the auto business. We say here, why let a good crisis go to waste? And we said that in 2001, and we said it in 2008, before Obama's chief of staff said it or whatever. And I think that we've really focused on leaning out our company, really improving our processes and so forth, so that we're going to be a stronger company coming out of it. We owe that to our people. They expect us to do that. And at the end of the day, everyone talks about sustainability for companies. Well, sustainable companies are companies that are around a long time. And so we're thinking about how can we be stronger in 5 years and 10 years. We understand the challenges. We understand that, the markets have gone down and our equity value has gone down. But the true value of our company is resiliency and our ability to be sustainable for the long term. So we're focused on a lot of that stuff. As we look at the broad trends, I think it's going to be very interesting. I think, the future of the automobile. How are we going to come back on volumes? I think that a lot of people are saying, you know what, when I travel around, I don't have to fly that far. I can drive, I can control my environment, I can socially distance. It's going to be very interesting to see what that does ultimately to auto sales. I think house sales, a lot of people are going to say, I don't mind moving to the suburb. I'm learning how to work remotely. I'm learning that, living away and having a backyard in my own place where I don't have to get on an elevator and I'm distancing everywhere is interesting. I think we're going to have some more real estate investment. I think that you're going to see less people traveling on public transit. I think you're going to see less people commuting every day to big, tall office buildings. So we look at those societal things, and I think some of those are actually very good. And I also think that on a societal basis, a lot of people are going to say, you know what, maybe I was running the rat race a little too heavy. Maybe I'm realizing the value of spending time with family, spending time with friends, spending time with social groups such as churches and other community organizations. Maybe those things, and I'm certainly very hopeful that those things are going to be viewed as a lot more valuable. There's some real positives in the context of how we do things. When you're not working and making any parts for cars for a while, you get very reflective and you can think about these things.
So we have a question here from one of our friends in Ontario, Wilf Wickrink, who also lived in Oxford last year. So I'll just read it out quickly. Thanks for your input today and also for some of the great writing you've been doing lately. How do we continue to change the narrative and get people to realize that COVID is a threat, but not the threat that governments and the media have made it out to be? It appears to me that governments are simply following the media, medical experts, and social media. We need them to lead. So that's an interesting thing that you've addressed in your writing. So maybe just describe to people. So, you know, we both have a legal background. So in law, you look at the facts. The key thing, the key starting point, of course, is the facts and to get those straight. So we get a narrative from the government, let's say in Canada on a federal basis, that the experts have said this, therefore I'm responding a certain way. But of course, as thinking individuals, as Christians, as, you know, having often a different worldview, we need to analyze what people are saying. So how do you view the narrative that's being presented?
I think the narrative's been horrible. I think at the end of the day, and I, gave you all the things I studied, and I've been involved with some think tanks and everything. I'm not sure, the fact that I've done a lot of things shows maybe I can't figure out what I really want to do. But the one thing I think I'm pretty good at is logic. And lawyers are taught that way, but so are philosophers and so are economists, and I've done a fair bit of that. And so at the end of the day, we lost the narrative in the beginning. We lost the narrative when we talked about the fatality rate. You have cases and then you have fatality rate, and the WHO said the fatality rate's 3.4%. That's almost criminally negligent, because at the end of the day, it only measured cases that effectively showed people with COVID-19, and it didn't show those people that had COVID-19 that, weren't at hospitals and all that type of stuff. The true fatality rate is an awful lot less, because a lot of people get exposed, don't get symptoms. A lot of people get it and heal themselves, and they're not part of the statistics and so forth. So the fatality rate is significantly less. So to say that that's what it is, that's the case fatality rate when you actually test and so forth. That dialogue was, as I said, criminally irresponsible, and that's the one that got picked up front. And then that matched with the surge in Italy, and there's different reasons for that, and we don't have to get into it, but at the end of the day, that scares people too. And so that's been effectively the rhetoric. But there have been a lot of people essentially say, let's look at the expert opinions, and as Brian puts in his excellent MLI article, the experts have been proven wrong time after time, and there is not just one view. There's a lot of stuff coming out of Stanford, MIT, pretty good places, right, that effectively say this disease is not actually that dangerous. And at the end of the day, if we know that, then maybe we have a different perspective. Maybe we aren't talking about lockdowns. The other thing is that there are vulnerable folks to this. It's not nice if you have immune systems that are down, or if you're in a vulnerable part of society, like if you're 80 years old and in a nursing home, you are vulnerable. 80% of our deaths in Canada are from people that are 75 or 80 years old, that are in nursing homes or long old age homes, and that have underlying causes. And then when we measure it, basically we don't measure that you have COVID-19. In other words, you die with it, but you die of it. There's one example in Italy that someone was crossing the street, got hit by a car, got killed, but had COVID-19, and that was shown as a COVID-19 death. That type of stuff is just ridiculous. There's no question that the incidence of the disease, it is an infectious disease. Not everyone dies from it. In Ontario, at least, no one under 20 has died from it. Very few people under 40, very few people under 60 that are healthy. So if as we go, we will eventually get the facts right, because people are relatively smart. They effectively develop a certain view, and as someone was telling me yesterday, the reality is that human beings are risk-taking people. We drive and we know that we can die of an accident. We go flying and there can be a crash, and at the end of the day, people will essentially say, look, I can get this thing, I'm not going to die from it. The hospital's got plenty enough ventilators for the next 50 years for me to, take care of me. And I'm gonna go forward, and I'm gonna manage my life. And I think we'll eventually get there. And then, at some point, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we're going to look back at this and say, this was an overreaction, much like the Dutch tulip boom of 1620.
Right. This is a modern day, possibly a modern day tulip mania. Now, here's a question I'll throw out because I know you'll get a kick out of it. When are you going to run for office?
Yeah, I do not have politically correct views enough, but I will say this. Different people do different things, and I've been very much blessed by being in the industry that I am and the company that I am and with the background that I have to talk to a lot of leading edge politicians. They don't always agree with me, I would say, but I'm in dialogue with our deputy prime minister and industry minister and our premier and so forth, and they don't always agree with my views. They agree with some of the views because the restart of the auto industry and the COVID-19 task force recommendations are being accepted by government. At the same time, and we have these debates, the government will eventually follow what the public wants. That's a view that I think the government's there to lead and not necessarily to follow what the public wants, but eventually you get the public on side and the government will follow. And so at the end of the day, public service is a lot more than just running for politics.
Right. Well, that's a great segue. I just wanted to highlight one point for everyone who's listening, that one of the things that ELO focuses on is empowering marketplace leaders to have maximum impact in their respective spheres of influence. And Rob's a great example. So in other words, we all know we don't have to be in full-time ministry. I mean, there are those who take that route, which is great. But for people who are in business, in the professions, in the marketplace, of course, we can have a huge amount of influence among the circles in which we move, as Rob's an example of. So I just want to focus on, so we have 10 minutes left. So for those of you who haven't answered a question yet, I'm trying to, direct those questions to Rob as I see them come up. But so for the last 10 minutes, if you have a question, just send it to me as soon as you can. But I wanted to focus on the spiritual dimension. Now, one of the things that you highlighted in your writings as one of the impacts of the present pandemic is that people may start to focus on deeper things and reflect on, well, what actually is important in life. So maybe just talk to that.
Well, I think we all have a purpose-driven life, and your ministry may include working as a business leader or service in business and so forth. And I think that whether times are good or whether times are challenging, you've got the same ministry in the context of what you do. What am I all about? Who am I living for? What's my purpose in life? And I think that I've been blessed to be in certain places, and I think that challenges bring opportunities, and so this is one of them. I think that I am hopeful that a lot of people are focusing on where does your comfort really come from? What this has done is it's shown that a lot of people are not in control of what they think they are. This has been, a real game changer, at least in that thinking. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of people that, find comfort in our Creator are going to say, this is a new challenge, but, a lot of people have been through challenges. I've got parents that went through World War II and, born in a depression, and the World War wasn't so good, and afterwards wasn't so good. And then they immigrated to Canada and they started with nothing, but they were pretty happy. And they look at, this generation and they say, it's about time this generation in Canada, the United States, and Europe experienced a war or a famine or pestilence or something like that, because at the end of the day, the overreaction is in part that we haven't seen that. But I think there's a real chance to focus here. And one of my friends said to me, he says, we may lose some people to COVID-19. And I think we're losing some people because of COVID-19 to cancer and so forth, because they don't have access to the medicine and so forth. But we have an opportunity to gain a lot of people for faith. And so, you know, there are different motivational speeches. One of the ones that I always liked is Kurt Russell, it's Herb Brooks talking to the 1980 US Olympic team when they were playing the Soviet Union. I know that there are, you know, probably better scriptural references, but he had this speech to his players. He said, "This is our time," right? This is our time. And so at the end of the day, when we have these opportunities, we have to seize it. And I think you seize it in your businesses, you seize it with your families, you seize it in the spiritual sense too. And quite frankly, you know, we have a number of heroes in this pandemic, obviously frontline health workers, but some of the stuff that people are doing with food banks and with, you know, battered kids shelters and so forth, and working with the poor are absolutely tremendous. And this is an opportunity for us to bring comfort to a lot of people. And that's an opportunity that God has given us.
Mm-hmm. There's a few questions related to working with government. So, you know, one of the challenges in countries is, you know, we want to make a difference as Christian leaders, and often we have to figure out how to get the cooperation at least, or in some ways to collaborate with the government. So what lessons could you share that you've learned from, you know, your considerable dealings with government officials? Like because people can take different approaches. One is to just not to be involved, but the other way, of course, is to you know, just say they may not think exactly like us, but you know, we have to figure out some way to make a difference. So maybe just talk about that.
Well, the concept of service includes public service, and so you can get involved in a lot of different things. And you know, I've had the privilege of being involved in a lot of economic and industry things. But you know, I've run into a lot of Christians in different governments, certainly in the United States and Mexico, but also in Canada. You know, the clerk of the Privy Council is a Presbyterian minister. And so that doesn't mean that, you know, we are preaching sermons while we're talking about economic policy, but we can certainly talk about, you know, how do you help people? And when we're talking, say, in an industry basis like ours, I think it's pretty evident that, you know, leaders of companies, for example, they care about their people a lot. Those are the people that, you know, give them their positions and their strength, and we're very proud of our companies and so forth. And so you convey that type of thing, and ultimately people will watch how you act. Are you hypocritical? You know, people are going to know. Your workers are going to know. Your family's going to know, and everything else.
Well, and one of the challenges, of course, sometimes the Christian community will be characterized or even caricatured as, you know, a bunch of whiners on the sidelines, not really being positive contributors. So on that note, we have a really good question from someone in Ontario. Now, you wrote, you were one of the signatories of a letter to an open letter to the Prime Minister. And for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with that, you can, Tessa will post the link online. So Rob and a number of business leaders wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister of Canada. So the question here is, did you get is that effect? Did you get a response to that?
Well, quietly, the answer is yes. And that letter was, first of all, penned by Brian Lee Crowley, who is a very influential guy, one of the most influential guys in Ottawa, and he's managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which has been ranked the #1 think tank in Ottawa. And the signatories were not just business folks; they were from a wide variety, including economists, health experts, and so forth. You know, people that have essentially said you got to deal with the facts and everything else. And so we've had a number of supporters and so forth, but a lot of the discussions are behind the scenes. And so in that sense, the letter was picked up by the National Post. I'm not sure that that's the newspaper that's, you know, read by the federal Liberal government as much as perhaps some other papers, but it's certainly read a lot by the provincial Conservatives. And you know, we talk to these people, and you know, I always, when I talk to a public servant and when I talk to a politician, I always say, you know, my job is to give you my view of the facts. And I say the facts, but recognize my background, and you can take it like that. But, you know, let's be hard on the facts and let's be hard on the logic, because you've got to defend your logic to people like me as well. And so I've had the privilege of working with Liberals, Conservatives, and so forth over time. You can have that type of discussion, and eventually all these things are elements in terms of turning the tide. And you got to make the effort. You got to make the effort. At the end of the day, where we see elements of success in many different things. The province of Ontario yesterday morning said we're going to allow church services where you have cars in a parking lot. A month ago, the cops were giving tickets to people in a parking lot, which is insane because I don't know how you talk about social distancing for cars. But at the end of the day, that's because the premier had a phone call which followed a letter from 250 pastors to say we're socially distancing, and at the end of the day, you shouldn't, if you can socially distance for a grocery store, you can certainly socially distance for a church.
So Rob, we have a question that just came in along those lines. So for those of us who would share, let's say, the views that we've been discussing here, what can people do? Is it a form of mild political activism or gentle nudging, or are Christians effectively disregarded because they're disorganized, ineffective, and people don't really care what we think?
Well, we're trying, at the end of the day, people don't care what a lot of people think. We're not the only ones that experience that. Sometimes it's the people that clang the loudest that get the most attention, but we have to keep at it. And there's some great organizations doing it, like ARPA, for example, has a very good way of dialoguing with Parliament. We think we do that at Cardis very well as well.
Just say what ARPA is.
It's the Association of Reformed Political Action. Right. It's a group in Ottawa. It's intervened in courts and so forth, and it's gotten bills introduced in the House of Commons. So, people that are making a difference. But we've got to take our dialogue in different things. And to a certain extent, I wouldn't necessarily advocate civil disobedience. But at the end of the day, if we had lockdowns imposed on our churches, for example, that we could never meet again, I'm just reading the autobiography of my grandfather, who was a minister in Wezet, which is a church in Eastern Holland during World War II, and they had 5 years of Nazi or German invasion. I don't know if they had missed a church service. They had church service, and a bomb landed in the church front yard. So at the end of the day, to a certain extent, I don't think Christians should stand for the fact that they have to social distance to the extent that they can't meet in different ways. Let's get inventive. Let's get creative. Let's say we have a freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are things we need to do. And, quite frankly, there are a lot of religious groups that would come along with us in that type of thing. And I think that we'll see that. In the U.S., the Attorney General has essentially warned California that by, removing obstacles to meeting together, they're discriminating against churches, and they should, give churches as much right as restaurants and gyms. That's the type of dialogue we have to have.
Well, that's a great note on which to end this conversation. So we're exactly at 1 hour now. Rob, thank you very much for your great insights, sharing your experiences. You have a completely unique background and perspective. So appreciate that greatly. And to everyone who's been listening in from around the world and has submitted questions, thank you very much. And we will be following up with an email. There is a recording of this webinar, so you can check back on some of those comments. We'll also be doing some blog posts. So again, thank you, Rob, and thank you to everyone who has listened in today.